Story 1. Oh, I've got a good one. For whatever reason, I thought that if something was wrapped in plastic and kept for a really long time, it would increase in value. My parents watched a lot of Antiques Roadshow, which is the only explanation I can offer besides me being kind of a weird kid. So I received a wrapped game of Parcheesi for a birthday or something, and I kept it in my closet, waiting for the day it would surely be worth hundreds. Story 2. I knew blood was inside me because I had seen it come out, but I had no idea about organs. At one point, I thought I was basically just a sack of blood without anything else inside, like a water balloon. Story 3. My mom taught me humans have two stomachs. 1. An ordinary stomach. 2. A dessert stomach. Her reasoning for this: no matter how full you are, you always have room for dessert. I believed this for such a long time until I was a teenager and had biology in school. Story 4. That mushrooms can hear you and will hide when looking for them. My dad used to take me morel mushroom hunting when I was a kid and always told me to be as quiet as possible because the mushrooms will go back into the ground if they hear me. Many years later, I found out we were just trespassing on somebody's property. Story 5. One day my father opened a letter that arrived, and he exclaimed that our neighbor had died. He was an older man who was around 60 at that time. The next day I left my house to go to school when, on my way, I saw my neighbor. I seriously thought I was seeing a ghost and was freaking out for a while. I later realized we also had neighbors on the other side, but I had only ever seen the wife of the deceased person and genuinely didn't know she wasn't living alone all this time. Story 6. Ice melting in a drink made the drink colder. So, if I put a bunch of ice in a drink and then microwaved it until the ice had all melted, it would make the drink super cold a lot quicker. Story 7. Oh boy. I was born in 1989 for reference. Antennas on top of roofs were skeletal remains of crashed airplanes. The police would randomly check in on houses to make sure no crimes were being committed, so if I ate cookies or spilled juice, I would blame it on the police. Gas stations were mandated to provide free air as they were responsible for depleting all air from the planet, so they had to allow anyone who needed it to get it. Speaking of planets, I thought protein was planet, and cheese had a lot of planet because the moon was made from cheese. They considered it planet because it occurred before they knew the moon is not a planet. Storefronts with help wanted signs were stupid because they never showed the criminal who was wanted even though they needed our help. Story 8. My dad told me when I was potty training that if I sat on the toilet for too long, my toes would turn blue and fall off. I fully believed that until I was legitimately about 17. Story 9. I used to half listen to whatever my parents had on the radio in the car, and I remember being 5 years old and thinking Palestinians were Palestinians. I thought everyone was talking about things happening to these rich people in India. Why were they always in the news? Was it because they were rich? Why couldn't they just enjoy their palaces and stay out of the news? Thinking back now, it had to be sometime around the Oslo Accords. Story 10. I believe that my dad was an art collector. What kind of art did he collect? Glass-blown art. He would leave his beautiful glass-blown art pieces all over the house and sometimes even use them to light incense. Bongs. My dad collected bongs. Story 11. That our hands would blow off if we stuck them out the car window. If we didn't rinse off dishes really well when washing dishes by hand, we would get this terrible disease called the GI shits. To this day, I will re-rinse a dish if my husband leaves soap suds on it. We don't have a dishwasher and no room for one. Story 12. My brother told me the swelling from mosquito bites was from eggs they laid under your skin. I was so scared of mosquitoes for a while I peed in the corner of my room a few times rather than walk through the house at night to the bathroom. Story 13. My oldest sister convinced us that trolls come out of the toilet if you don't close the lid before you flush. She even went as far as dressing up as one to truly traumatize us. Laughing my ass off. Story 14. That teachers were only allowed in the schools and not allowed to go anywhere else. I almost freaked out the first time I ran into a teacher at the grocery store with my dad. Story 15. People were confined in my television and acting out routines for me live every single time, even during reruns. Not even sure that would be more disturbing than the reality of the entertainment industry anyway. Story 16. I used to think that when you got into an accident and pushed the hazard light button, a crane with a magnet on the end would come out of the hood and pick up the car you ran into and throw it out of the way. Story 17. That if you lie down or sleep with your knees up and your legs open, you would get hip disease. I was about 28 when I realized my parents told us that so we would be less likely to masturbate in bed. I am female and was raised in an extremely conservative Christian home. Story 18. That a car would run out of beeps and my parents would have to get a new one. We couldn't afford a new one, and it definitely stopped us from honking the horn. Story 19. That I would grow up to be anything. Birth defect and heart failure later, and I'm just trying to live life to the fullest. I also thought The Undertaker was real in the World Wrestling Federation. No one explained it to me as a kid. His opening entrance plus the Ministry of Darkness era terrified me. Story 20. When I was a kid, I always believed that people who spoke other languages would first think about what they wanted to say in my language, I am Italian, and then talk in German, English, Spanish, etc. Story 21. I had a habit of always sticking my finger into my belly button. My grandmother told me that if I kept doing it, my bottom would fall off. I believed that for longer than I care to admit. Story 22. I'm from the Ozarks, so my grandma's house was surrounded by woods, and she used to tell my siblings and me that there were monkeys that lived in the woods and would kidnap us if we wandered too far. Now I realize she was just trying to keep us from getting lost or eaten by a mountain lion. Story 23. When I was a young child, I thought Pat Sajak on Wheel of Fortune could see the future because he would call out the wheel while it was slowing down, and my naive child brain didn't understand science yet. Story 24. I saw an anti-drug commercial that was about sniffing glue, and it said, "Sniffing can make you feel like you're drowning." My innocent little 7-year-old brain thought they meant sniffling your nose when you were sick, so I refused to sniff my nose while sick for years until I figured it out. Story 25. I was riding next to my dad in a car with a tachometer. I asked what revolutions per minute stood for. He told me it was revolutions per minute. What does that mean? It's how many times the engine turns over in a minute. For the next couple of years, I thought the whole engine block was spinning under the hood. I was around 6. Story 26. I often look at clouds and think they are soft, fluffy, sugary cotton candy that could be eaten. The idea of a giant cotton candy sky is a fun and strange thought. Haha. Story 27. I walked in on my babysitter watching Alien right when the android gets cut in half toward the end, and white fluid starts pouring out of him. I was about 6 years old at the time and thought that's what happens when people get cut in half for quite a few years. Story 28. Moms and dads all had to be the same age since mine were 3 weeks apart in age. The world was in black and white before somewhere in the 1960s when color was invented because that's when TV shows started coming in color. Story 29. I knew that sex was something private and involved nudity, and so did going to the bathroom. So, somehow, I came to the conclusion that sex involved pooping into another person's anus. Story 30. Whenever I saw one of those reporters on television with press written on their clothes or hat, I thought someone was supposed to physically press the person. Story 31. That light sources at night had beams coming off of them in an X was a superpower, and I could see ley lines or something. Nope. My eyes were just messed up. Story 32. Nothing was worse than being made fun of for having a crush on a girl. No one could ever know that I had a crush on someone or it would destroy my life. Story 33. I used to believe that the term destroyed was specifically for when something explodes. I think the image that solidified it was the Death Star exploding. Imagine my tiny child brain trying to cope with the news report that there was a vicious dog attack and the police had to destroy the dog. Story 34. I thought all radio was live bands performing. But even worse, I thought that a record player was another form of radio. What I couldn't understand was how the band knew to start playing right when you put the needle down. Story 35. If you want to develop or drive on a street with a state name, you should be in that state. Also, if you went through a green light at an intersection and could see the red light in the opposite direction, you ran a red light. Story 36. Didn't understand movie magic. Thought if someone got shot in a movie, they got shot for real. Never understood how someone who died in a movie could star in another one. Story 37. My grandma made me believe that if I leaned out of the balcony or window, a witch woman would take me. It wasn't just weird but scary. Needless to say, it made so much sense later. Story 38. There was a razor blade in my throat that would chop up my food so I didn't have to chew. I would swallow food whole or try to chew the least amount possible. Story 39. I thought in case of fire, use stairs meant that just in case there was a fire, you should never use the elevator. I was confused as to why they even had them there. Story 40. If an adult called you dear or honey, it meant they wanted to marry you. I have no idea where I got this from, but I believed this until I was about 7 or 8. Story 41. If you swallow a watermelon seed, a watermelon will grow in your stomach. Totally believed that and was paranoid for weeks after eating watermelon. Story 42. I thought the phases of the moon were Earth's shadow blocking sunshine on the moon's surface. I was always confused because it still didn't make perfect sense based on the shadow shapes, but I figured it out eventually. Story 43. I thought that urine and feces come from the same canal for some reason. I remember discussing with a friend what the first thing is that comes out in the toilet, urine or feces. We had different orders. Story 44. That I could get to Narnia through my wardrobe, but it only happened when I didn't know it was happening, so I never got through. That vampires and werewolves were real. I was a very literal kid. Story 45. I used to have the fear that my stepfather could hear my thoughts, so I was careful about what I thought when he was around. As an adult, thankfully, I did not have such an issue, and I remember it only lasted for a short time. Recently, I discovered that this is called thought broadcasting and stems from stress during childhood and an overactive imagination. Story 46. There is a Catholic basilica in my community, and it is big and beautiful, of course. When I was little, I thought it was a castle, and I told my mom I wanted to go to Disneyland. We are not Catholic, so I never went. If I had, I would have realized much sooner how wrong I was. Story 47. This one doesn't even make sense when I think back on it, but when I was 4 or 5, I used to be convinced that the arms on a construction crane were helicopter blades. I guess they recycled old helicopter blades into construction equipment. I don't know how it worked, but I do have memories of people trying to explain why that's not the case, and I was very dead set in my beliefs. Story 48. I screamed and cried while being potty trained because I believed something was going to crawl out of the toilet and get me. My mom sensed this, and this conversation followed. Mom, what's wrong? Are you afraid something is going to come out and grab you? Me, yes. Mom, well, that's not going to happen, I promise. I instantly stopped crying and was officially potty trained. I just needed the reassurance. Story 49. That vampires would only hunt between 12 o'clock and 12:01 because they could only be out at midnight exactly. So if I woke up scared and made it to 12:01, I'd be fine for the rest of the night. Story 50. That adults had it all together. I was set straight by my 7th grade English teacher who had a massive tantrum and called me, "You people," plus a word I had never heard before. But from the context, I knew it meant other. There were no witnesses. I walked out in the middle of her rage rant and never told anyone. Story 51. That people with rabies will run around on all fours in torn clothes with foam dripping from their mouths and bite other people, spreading rabies. Story 52. If you treat others nicely, follow the rules, be kind and respectful, and so on, life will reward you. If you are rude, mean not cooperative, consistently talk back to people of authority, and take advantage of other people, life will punish you. In other words, karma. I still try to be a good person regardless, but it was disappointing to find out that karma does not exist. Story 53. I used to think that if you have one medical condition, you were somehow immune from getting any others. Oh, how I wish that were true. I have cystic fibrosis, hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, arthritis, and epilepsy. Story 54. When I was around 5 or 6 years old, I used to believe that tumbleweeds hatched from eggs. I used to live in Texas, and we would see tumbleweeds all the time. I wondered how they could grow like other plants if they were rolling around all the time. I was also really into natural science, such as dinosaurs and jungles, and watched these nature documentaries for kids called Really Wild Animals, starring a talking cartoon globe named Spin. One episode focused on coral reefs and described coral as an animal that looks like a plant. From that description, I figured that tumbleweeds must be a kind of land coral and were really animals that just looked like dried up bushes. I guessed that they probably lay eggs too and imagined them as being soft-shelled like snake eggs and about the size of beach balls. I spent a lot of time in my own head as a kid. Also, for those of you who are wondering, tumbleweeds do start out growing out of the ground and look like typical desert shrubs. They eventually dry out to let the wind snap them off at the base so they can then roll around spreading seeds. Story 55. When I was in elementary school, I thought the country of Niger was pronounced like the N-word, and I thought Nigeria was pronounced like the N-word plus an A at the end. I also knew the N-word was a bad thing to say, so I was constantly terrified about whether we would ever discuss countries in Africa, as I didn't want to get in trouble for saying a bad word. Needless to say, I have since learned that I was thankfully incorrect.